Study 145. Chanel stops shredding unsold goods, circularity as brand sovereignty, from the objects of affection collection. On the shredder, the recycling hub, and the discovery that a luxury house can govern an object's death more profitably than it ever governed its life. The figure surfaced, as the most revealing figures do, by accident. During a 2017 criminal trial in Hong Kong, two former warehouse staff, accused of trying to steal 724 luxury items bound for destruction. Prosecutors stated the quantity plainly. Chanel's Hong Kong operation destroyed between 10 and 20,000 products every 6 months. Handbags, wallets, jewelry, shoes, sorted, logged, and unmade on a schedule. The theft was the scandal the court was there to try. The destruction was merely the context, mentioned in passing, and it was the context that should have stopped the room. Chanel has since said the number does not reflect Chanel's current global practices, and points to two mechanisms, EU Death Matières and a newer holding called Nevold, as proof that unsold goods are now recycled rather than shredded. The trade press has filed this as a sustainability story. It is not, or not only. It is a story about how a house learned to convert the destruction of its own objects from a liability into an asset, and it is a more sophisticated exercise of the same sovereignty that ran the shredder. The number in the court file. Begin with what the shredding actually was. A finished Chanel object, a bag that passed through the hands of a leatherworker, a specific hide, a specific run of hardware, was on failing to sell deliberately unmade, not discounted, not donated, not sold through an outlet, destroyed so that it could never appear on a body or in a resale vitrine at a price the house did not set. 10 to 20,000 times every 6 months in one territory alone. We have a name for the logic that requires this. It is the Archival Death Mandate, the strategic destruction of material objects to protect an abstract brand value that the objects, by merely continuing to exist, would dilute. The bag is killed not because it is defective, but because it is surplus, and surplus in the economy of scarcity is contamination. The house would rather annihilate the labor and material embodied in the object than allow that object to enter a market on terms other than its own. The shredder is not a waste disposal system. It is a scarcity maintenance system that happens to consume finished goods. This is institutional necrophagy in its purest commercial form, an institution feeding on the destruction of the very objects that carry its meaning. We have traced the same appetite through the deaccessioning and quiet erasure of cultural holdings. Here it wears a couture label, and it exposes the lie beneath the luxury promise. The house that markets the permanence and preciousness of its object will, the moment that object threatens its pricing power, treat it as garbage with a security detail. And every destroyed unit is a quantum of erased human work, the labor density of the leatherworker, the finisher, the artisan whose hours are embodied in the object, and then fed to a shredder. The house that builds its entire marketing on the sanctity of the maker's hand routinely annihilates that hand's output by the 10,000. The two facts are not in tension by accident. The same scarcity logic that valorizes the labor also requires its periodic destruction, because labor that survives as too many finished objects becomes supply, and supply is the enemy. Chanel is not alone in this, and the comparison sharpens the point. In 2018, Burberry disclosed that it had destroyed more than £28 million worth of unsold product in a single year, incinerated rather than discounted, and the public reaction forced a reversal. Across the sector, destruction was, until regulators intervened, simply how scarcity was maintained at industrial scale. The standard, hidden operating cost of the aura. What ultimately distinguishes Chanel is not that it shredded, but what it went on to build once shredding became untenable. Roman 2. Why a house kills its own objects. To grasp why destruction was ever rational, you have to take scarcity seriously as the actual product. Chanel does not, in the end, sell handbags. It sells the guarantee that the handbag is difficult to get and expensive to keep. That guarantee is what we call a zero-sum aura, a prestige that exists only in proportion to others' exclusion from it. Every unsold unit that leaks into a discount channel or a grey market is a small puncture in that guarantee. Destroy the unit and the puncture never opens. The threat that scarcity most fears is no longer the discount rack but the resale platform. A vigorous secondary market, authenticated, liquid, price-transparent, publishes a valuation of the object that the house does not set, and a surplus unit sold into that market becomes a live data point contradicting the primary price. Destruction was, among its other functions, a way of denying the resale market its supply. This is why a surplus object is dangerous in a way a merely unsold object is not. Left alive and in circulation, it testifies to a value the house would rather keep unspoken. The founder understood this arithmetic before it had a name. Gabrielle Chanel built a house on the paradox of conspicuous restraint, the little black dress as anti-ostentation that only the initiated could read, and restraint, monetized, requires scarcity enforced. The modern shredder is simply that principle industrialized, the aura defended not by design but by logistics, in a warehouse in Signy. What the 2017 disclosure punctured was not the practice but its invisibility. The destruction had always been the hidden cost of the visible scarcity. The trial dragged it into the light. And a scarcity strategy that depends on the public not knowing what it costs is a strategy with a structural weakness, one that regulation was about to exploit. Roman 3, the law arrives. Here the sustainability framing quietly omits the decisive actor. Chanel's pivot away from shredding is contemporaneous with the European Union's Ecodesign for Sustainable Products Regulation, which prohibits the destruction of unsold clothing, footwear and accessories, and compels companies to disclose how much stock they write off and how. The blunt instrument of destruction did not become unfashionable. It became illegal. This matters to the reading, because a virtue performed under legal compulsion is not the same object as a virtue freely chosen, and the house's own language, in line with its sustainability commitments, is engineered to blur exactly that difference. The burden of preservation, which the house spent years discharging with a shredder, was not lifted by conscience. It was imposed by statute. What Chanel then did with that imposition is the genuinely interesting move, because rather than merely comply, it built an apparatus that turns the obligation into an advantage. Roman 4, L'Atelier des Matières. L'Atelier des Matières, created in 2019 on Chanel's initiative, is the rematerialization engine. All Chanel products worldwide that cannot be commercialized, dead stock, unsold, defective now pass through it. Ready-to-wear leather goods, shoes and loose materials, threads, textiles, chains, buttons, hides, are collected, sorted, disassembled, extracted, and transformed into recycled materials. On its face, this is the shredder's redemption. The object is not annihilated but returned to the material stream. Read the destination of those materials, though, and the redemption narrows. The recovered matter re-enters production largely as internal, non-visible components, the structure inside a thing rather than the surface of a new thing bearing the name. The house recovers the material value while scrupulously withholding the recovered material from the site where material singularity is sold, the visible, signed, price-bearing object. The bag that failed to sell does not come back as a bag, it comes back as the unseen skeleton of one. Recycling that keeps the recovered material out of sight is not a renunciation of scarcity. It is scarcity with a better conscience. This is the hinge of the whole case. Destruction protected scarcity by making the surplus object cease to exist. Rematerialization protects scarcity by making the surplus object cease to be recognizable, dissolved into a substrate the market cannot read as Chanel. The visible economy of exclusion is untouched. What changed is only the fate of the matter, and even that fate is now governed to the same end. V. Nevold. And the monetization of the afterlife, then comes the move that ends any remaining doubt about what this is. In 2025, Chanel formally launched Nevold, an independent business-to-business hub for circular materials, backed by a reported 50 to 80 million euros, that gathers L'Atelier des Matières together with a legacy wool-spinning mill and an upcycled leather specialist. Nevold is constituted as a separate entity, explicitly designed to operate beyond Chanel's own ateliers, and to supply recycled materials to other fashion houses, and to industries as far afield as sportswear, automotive and aviation. Consider what has happened across these three steps. The house first destroyed its surplus at a cost, the Archival Death Mandate. It then reprocessed its surplus to comply with law L'Atelier des Matières. It has now built a business that sells the reprocessed surplus and the reprocessing expertise itself to third parties at a profit, Nevold. The waste stream, once a line item to be shredded in secret, is now a revenue-generating division with a brand of its own. The reach is the audacious part. A house whose entire value rests on being unlike anything mass-produced now proposes to sell its recovered materials into sportswear and aviation, the most anonymous, functional, scale-driven industries there are. The surplus that was too contaminating to sell as a discounted Chanel bag is apparently pure enough to sell as feedstock to an airframe supplier. The contradiction is only apparent. What Chanel protects is the visible sign, never the material beneath it. Strip the name and the matter is fungible, and Chanel will now broker the fungible matter while guarding the name more jealously than ever. This is the alchemy the sustainability headline cannot see. Chanel has not surrendered control over the afterlife of its objects. It has industrialized that control and attached a price to it. The same sovereignty that once expressed itself as annihilation now expresses itself as a materials market that Chanel convenes and sits atop. The house governs the death of its object more profitably than it ever governed the object's life on the shelf. VI. Sovereignty relocated, not renounced, set the three mechanisms beside one another, and the through line is unmistakable. At no point does Chanel relinquish the right to determine what its object may become. The shredder said the object may become nothing. L'Atelier des Matières says it may become an invisible interior. Nevold says it may become a raw material Chanel sells onward. Different verdicts, one court, and the house is always the judge. Weighed against a genuine custodian's contract, under which the holder of an object accepts responsibility for it rather than dominion over it, this is control wearing the costume of care. A custodial act would let the surplus object live, enter the world, be worn, be repaired, accrue the narrative permanence that only use confers. Chanel's circularity does the opposite. It ensures the surplus object never lives as itself at all, that it is either destroyed, hidden, or sold as feedstock, but never permitted the ordinary afterlife of a thing that was made to last. Romans 7. What circularity would owe none of this is an argument for the shredder, and we should be precise about that. Rematerialization is materially better than destruction. Less embodied labor is lost, less goes to landfill, and the EU regulation that forced the change is sound. The critique is not that Chanel should have kept destroying goods. It is that circularity is being sold as an ethical conversion, when the evidence shows a commercial and legal adaptation that leaves the underlying logic, sovereign control of scarcity, entirely intact. What would a circularity that actually discharged the material covenant look like? It would let recovered Chanel objects re-enter the world as Chanel objects, repaired, resold under the house's own guarantee, their provenance honored rather than dissolved. It would treat an anti-sale covenant as a promise to the object's future, not a tool for suppressing its resale. It would measure success by how many made things were kept alive, not by how efficiently surplus was routed back into the supply chain it came from. The tell, in the current model, is the insistence on invisibility. A house confident that its circularity served the object rather than the aura would not need to hide the recovered material inside the lining. Such a model already exists in miniature, which is what makes its absence at the top of the market pointed. Repair ateliers, authenticated resale under a house's own warranty, made-to-last guarantees honored across decades. These are the ordinary mechanics of an object permitted a second life, and they are precisely the mechanics a scarcity house declines to scale, because each one loosens its grip on price. The choice between destroying a surplus bag and dissolving it into feedstock is a choice within a single refusal. The refusal to let the object circulate freely as itself. Circularity, honestly pursued, would begin exactly where Chanel stops, at the point where the object is allowed to outlive the house's control of it. A house that will not let its own object live a second life under its own name has not embraced circularity. It has found a cleaner way to keep control. Coda. The number in the Hong Kong court file, 10 to 20,000 objects, twice a year in one territory, was never really about waste, and the recycling hubs that answered it are not really about ecology. Both are expressions of a single conviction, that the house and only the house decides what its objects are allowed to be. Destruction and circularity are two dialects of that conviction, and Chanel now speaks the second more fluently and more lucratively than it ever spoke the first. The bag that failed to sell still does not get to be a bag, it has simply been given a more sustainable way to disappear.